Wow, good morning. Happy Thursday. We're halfway, well, we're done with the week. Tomorrow we see your film scoring results for The Goonies. And you did a great job with that, getting something that was a majestic, big, lush score in an adventure-like setting without any movement going on. They're just looking at the rocks. They're on the rocks, looking at the pirate ship. You know what I mean? So yesterday we looked at Mancini, his importance to television music. This was when television was huge, 50s and 60s. So this is good timing for Mancini because he's going to be writing TV shows. Peter Gunn, Pink Panther. These are TV shows that everyone's glued to the TVs. And it's particularly parents, right? I mean, kids are too, but the teenagers, we've seen the development of the teenager, the greaser, the person, they're going to be going out and having their own kind of finding, rock and roll and Chuck Berry. Parents are going to be listening to this kind of light music, instrumental pop music. Again, because it's, lack of a better word, it's safe music. It was probably considered very square back then, especially if you were a teenager that liked something, like if you liked bebop. It was nothing like bebop, and it was nothing like Chuck Berry. But with Mancini, you see elements borrowed. You see a little Chuck Berry with Peter Gunn, for sure, like with the guitar. And then with jazz and Pink Panther, you see his influence from that. And then with David Rose, he's earlier. But so in the 40s, with 1944, he starts A Holiday for Strings. But he starts this whole light music, in the middle of the 20th century. Because as we've seen, it goes back to Strauss and Mozart. Today we're going to finish it off with somebody that's a Swedish, origin, but American composer, Leroy Anderson. Leroy Anderson, American composer of light concert music, so light concert pieces. So we're going to talk about that kind of genre, and many of these pieces were introduced and first performed by the Boston Pops Orchestra, which they still perform all the time. John Williams, the famous composer, described Leroy as one of the great American masters of light orchestral music. It's going to be fun to explore his work, and we're going to talk about his life and also what was going on in the 1950s and just the history of light music. I know that's a generic term, but it actually is a genre of music. So Leroy Anderson, very memorable music. Very happy, optimistic music. We've looked at Bossa Nova and Brazil 66. That's happy music. And very intricate orchestrations that we're going to see. And very humorous music as well with this guy. Very gifted linguist. He was, in fact, he wanted to go into language, teaching language, because he was so prolific in so many different languages, but instead he decided to go into composing. So let's get into Leroy Anderson and light music. So light music is shorter orchestral pieces, so this is not Mahler, this is not symphonies, this is nothing like that, but that doesn't mean that light music was created when Leroy Anderson was born, or even in the 20th century. Light music goes back to even Mozart. See if you've heard this song before. hugely famous, right? A Little Night Music. That's by Mozart, written hundreds of years ago. That's considered light music. This isn't something, and it doesn't mean it's less important. It just means that it's not, it's going to evoke a light mood, right? What about this other composer? Remember we talked about this guy? See if you remember this piece. Very light music, that waltz, right? Remember we talked about the scandalous waltz, but how people loved the Blue Danube. We talked about Johann Strauss II. And so this is light. Light music has been going on for hundreds of years. And I mean, it's a perfect term for it because it does sound light. It's not overbearing. It's not, again, it's not like Mahler's Eighth Symphony at all. And other composers that we looked at, Henry Mancini, did a lot of light music, right? As well as David Rose. Weeks ago we did David Rose, and part of it, and we'll look at kind of the history of light music a little bit later. Part of it is because of television and because of movie scores kind of coming in. But let's talk about Leroy a little bit. Let's go from Germany, where we looked at Handel, to Cambridge. This is where Leroy is born to Swedish immigrants. His parents came from Sweden to the United States, and he came there as a child, given his first piano lesson by his mother. A lot of these composers get their musical training by their moms. I mean, even yesterday, Handel's mother was, because I think the dads are just like, you're going to be a strong guy going into law, or being a doctor or doing something like that, and the moms are a little bit more sensitive, maybe saying, well, if you want to do music, here's a piano. So not always the case, but at least the last composer today and yesterday, the mom was, and Leroy's mom was a church organist, and but he was on the path to being a pretty strict, like kind of classical trained composer. Studied piano at New England Conservatory of Music, which is still a great school. 1925, he goes to Harvard, and he studies music harmony and counterpoint and canons and fugues with Walter Piston, who was a huge composer of the day. Studied composition with him, studied double bass, studied organ, and graduated magna cum laude in 1929 from Harvard. I mean, to get a musical education from Harvard, so this guy had a super legit musical education, and then received a Master's of Arts in Music there in 1930. And was on his way to get a PhD in German and Scandinavian languages, because he spoke English, Swedish, and then also Danish, Norwegian, Icelandic. He was great at all these languages. So he's on the path, and I'm not sure exactly when he decided to just say, maybe I'll write more popular music. I don't know when that happened, because he's on the path, as we've just talked about, to being a serious, quote unquote, serious classical composer, studying music at Harvard in the 20s, which is where Bernstein studied too, a little bit later, not in the 20s, but he's on the path. And then he decides, maybe I'm more into the popular realm. So he wrote his first hit, Blue Tango, in 1951. This earned him a golden disc and the #1 spot on the Billboard charts. This was huge. Probably one of his most famous pieces. And along with the syncopated clock. I mean, see how fun this music is. So if his first big piece is 1951, if this is when he's writing this kind of light music, and we've talked about earlier light music, the 1950s, what's going on? Well, by 1950, 8 million people in the United States have televisions now. This is huge. It was all radio before, right? Especially the 40s with World War II, it was everyone's glued to the radio. Now they're going to be glued to television. And with television, I think you're going to get a lot of programming that where you're going to need lighter music, perhaps. And I mean, let's just review what music is going on in the 50s. This is the early start of rock and roll music, right? I mean, we looked at Little Richard, Ritchie Valens, Chuck Berry, Elvis. They're getting their starts in the 50s, right? This is really freaking out parents too, probably. And we're also getting Nat King Cole. I mean, there's so many artists that we get. I mean, the 1950s, so much music. I just want to give context on when Leroy is coming out. But what about country music? Country music, we're getting Johnny Cash, we're getting Hank Williams, and then rhythm and blues, Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, they're coming out. I mean, so much great music is coming out. What about classical music? Classical music is getting a little bit more into atonal music without a tonal center. So it's I don't want to say it's getting boring, but a lot of classical music is going into this realm of where there's not really a melody anymore. They're really getting rid of melody. Now, that's not true of all of them. Many classical composers in the 50s are still writing. People that we've done classes on, Prokofiev is still prolific. Villalobos is still writing fun Brazilian music. I mean, that's going to start bossa nova, right? Early bossa nova. And then Benjamin Britten we looked at last week. I mean, he's still writing. But those are the classical composers. And then jazz. I mean, this is bebop is kind of phasing out a little bit into cool jazz, into before hard bop. So we're getting Miles Davis started in the 1950s. We did a class on Chet Baker. Chet Baker's, that could almost be light music too. Some of this is light music. So this is when Leroy's on the scene. And perhaps what's so attractive about the light genre of music is that probably this is what the parents were listening to. Because it's just delightful music. But it's maybe it was considered a little square to listen to, but a lot of the parents, I think, were listening to this, because where do you go? Elvis is just for the kids, right? Classical music is getting a little bit too confusing to keep up with. Jazz is still kind of taboo in some senses. So somebody like Leroy Anderson comes along and writes very, clean, fun, humorous music. So probably his most famous piece, which is probably my favorite Christmas song that he wrote, is Sleigh Ride. He wrote this during a horrible heat wave in July in 1946, and he finished it in 1948. I guess it took 2 years to write this song. I don't know, maybe he just put it down. But and then the lyrics were added by Mitchell Parrish in 1950. Everybody knows Sleigh Ride. This is probably Leroy's most famous song. It's a Christmas standard, and it's what does it sound like? It's got an upbeat melody, right? There's sleigh bells. So something Leroy uses a lot are sound effects a little bit. We looked at Esquivel. Esquivel would always use sound effects. Other composers from different countries would use these things, Prentice Prado and stuff. But Leroy's American, so he's using very funny, quirky sounds in his music that's very musical sounding. I mean, including, you know, the typewriter song. This kind of music was so popular, and you can understand the value of it. Maybe it was a little square when it came out, but it was so fun, and I love this kind of music. I mean, light music is, I don't want to say it's safe music, but it's such fun, good music. And I love that he would use sound effects, whips, and all these whistles. Spike Jonze, somebody we might talk about, did that earlier, but Leroy everything came together really perfectly in the 50s. I just wanted to kind of show you a little bit of Leroy Anderson, great composer, on the track to be a classical composer, and then something in him was probably just like, you know, I'll make way more money doing this. So he dies in 1975, cancer in Connecticut, and was buried there. But what a great musical ear and really fun music. And this kind of music is so important to talk about that kind of gets glossed over because it's not serious music and it's not cutting edge music. It's just very delightful, fun sounding music. So really interesting that he was on the path to be an academic composer or somebody that taught at Harvard. He went to Harvard. I mean, he was so brilliant, you know, with languages and stuff, but so he had all the composition training to go on and be a serious classical composer or a classical professor of composition. Instead, he deviates somehow and he writes popular music and makes a great living, and we're talking about him today. I mean, probably because he wrote, you know, one of the greatest songs ever, definitely the best Christmas song, Sleigh Ride. It's like such a great song, and I love that video that I shared in that church. You know, it's really festive, but he was on a different path, and something, you know, it's funny he wrote that during a heat wave too. But Leroy, we're finishing up our light music week with Leroy Anderson because we looked at Mancini yesterday and David Rose, and parents and television were two huge things making this genre possible. But also it was good because that's why we're still talking about it today. If it was bad, you know, common subpar music, it would probably be forgetful because obviously there were a lot of other composers doing this kind of thing. But I just wanted to highlight the big ones to finish off our light music week. So tomorrow we see your film scoring results for the Goonies. Can't wait to show you that. Thanks for watching. Have a great rest of the day and see you tomorrow. Okay, bye.